I got a little in the weeds last night and ended up writing 5 articles when I intended to only write 1. So this is the first one. And I want to talk about the classic full frame versus Super 35 Speedbooster thing. It feels like every conversation about camera formats eventually circles back to the same debate, which is big sensor versus little sensor. And while I personally do like bigger sensors, I think people obsess about them in a way that is actually their obsession is more about optical characteristics and not the sensor size itself. And one of my goals as a journalist in the camera space, cinematography space, writing for Pro Video Coalition, doing the Frame and Reference podcast, making videos here, is to help filmmakers make educated decisions, whether it be financial or creative. So to make that sensors, optics distinction, I want to look past marketing hype and focus directly on physics. This is going to involve a lot of numbers and get very in the weeds. So hopefully I'm able to make it easy to understand by over-explaining it, but we'll see how this goes. So to start, if you take a full frame sensor and a Super 35 sensor, and both of them are native 4K, the physical surface area of the full frame sensor means its individual photosites are much larger. Think of photosites as buckets. Larger buckets will catch more photons in the same amount of time that smaller buckets would. This will give full frame sensors a higher signal to noise ratio, which will give you a cleaner image in low light scenarios. The larger photosites also have a higher capacity to hold electrical charge before they clip, which inherently expands the camera's dynamic range, giving you more latitude in your highlights and shadows. But the benefits of larger formats become even more pronounced when you look at a high resolution full frame sensor like an 8K sensor that downsamples its image to a 4K output compared to a Super 35 sensor recording native 4K. When you capture a scene with an 8K grid of photosites and mathematically downsample it to a 4K deliverable, you are executing a perfect 4:1 super sampling. So every single picture in your final 4K file is calculated by averaging a perfect 2x2 cluster of native 8K photosites. Because random electronic and photon noise across the photosites is completely random, averaging them out boosts your signal to noise ratio, effectively hands you one full extra stop of clean shadow detail. This is the same reason why the C100 that I'm filming on is so good, because it's a 4K sensor saving at 1080. So same thing, right? The averaging math directly improves color fidelity and gradient smoothness. By blending those 4 adjacent photosites into one pixel, the scaling algorithm minimizes digital errors, quantization errors, and it interpolates the subtle values between the digital hard steps, right? This creates smoother gradients and virtually eliminates color banding in low contrast areas like skies or out of focus backgrounds, effectively boosting the perceived bit depth of your final master. It will deliver a superior micro contrast and per pixel sharpness, completely avoiding the jagged artifacts and moire that can plague similar or smaller native resolution sensors. This is also why these really high 8K, 12K resolution sensors you'd think they'd be sharper, but they're actually smoother. They seem smoother in the final deliverable. But if you attempt to cram that 8K resolution down onto a smaller Super 35 sensor, the laws of physics push back. So to fit those 33 million pixels onto a smaller piece of silicon, the individual photosites have to be shrunk down. This is called pixel pitch. Pixel pitch is the size of the bucket, basically, and the sort of ideal is 8-ish, anywhere between 6 and 8 picos number. And interestingly enough, the Alexa sits right there. So that's fun. Also, the C500 and C70 have the same pixel pitch, but the C500 is a full frame sensor and the C70 is a smaller sensor, Super 35 sensor, but the performance is pretty close. The C500 edges it out because of the DGO processing, right? We can get to, I'm going to get to that in a different article. It's actually kind of interesting if you're a huge nerd. Though the tiny photosites on a Super 35 sensor are going to collect far fewer photons than bigger photosites on a bigger sensor, or bigger photosites in general, because it depends on 8K, 4K, 1080, whatever. So what'll end up happening is because the bucket is smaller, it fills up the electrical capacity a lot faster. So even though both formats get the same 4:1 downsampling math between the full frame and Super 35 sensors, the 8K full frame sensor is calculating its averages from a fundamentally cleaner, deeper, and more dynamic pool of data. Using my C500 as an example, though, that's a 6K sensor, and it's saving, unless you shoot RAW, it's saving at 4K. So you are still downsampling or super sampling, but only by 2.7 times. So that's not a clean 4:1 drop like the 8K sensor. So the math has to deal with fractional pixel mapping, basically like merging 1.5 photosites into one pixel, which involves a lot of complex scaling algorithms and stuff. And theoretically, there can be interpolation artifacts from that, but Canon seems to be pretty good at their math. Or any 6K sensor, it's still an advantage. But with an 8K sensor dropping to a 4K file, the math is perfectly clean. The next step up is 12K, which is why Blackmagic made a 12K camera. It's not to shoot 12K, it's to get better downscaling math, basically. The 4K coming out of the 12K camera is phenomenal. And then you can even do 8K from the 12K sensor. And then, you always want to shoot at a higher resolution than your deliverable. That's true regardless of sensor size or anything like that. Most digital cinema sensors use a Bayer pattern color filter array. So each photosite only captures one color, either red, green, or blue. All photosites are just measurements of electrical intensity, which is why like monochrome sensors are so high resolution, because instead of only using a pixel for a part of the Bayer equation, each pixel is just showing a gradient between black and white. So I think like what would normally be a 4K sensor then becomes an 8K sensor or something like that, just because you're not doing the Bayering. So the debayering algorithm guesses the missing color data for every pixel based on the color input it's getting from those color sensors. So a 2x2 cluster from an 8K sensor, that grid naturally contains 2 green photosites, 1 red and 1 blue. Because a 4K pixel requires exactly 1 green, 1 red, and 1 blue value, the 8K sensor provides a nearly direct, unguessed color readout for the final 4K master, completely eliminating color aliasing at the source. So, because of all these aforementioned advantages, filmmakers using smaller formats often look for a way to bridge that gap. And this is where the focal reducer comes into play, also known as the Speedbooster, which is a name owned by Metabones. And this is also where the widespread misconception that putting a focal reducer on a smaller sensor gives you the full frame look. So that's what we're getting into here. Any lens projects a circle of light inside the camera body, right? The imaging circle. The focal length remains the same. It's just the imaging circle that changes when you use a lens made for full frame or medium format or whatever. So when you mount that lens natively on a smaller Super 35 sensor, a full frame lens, that smaller sensor is only going to capture the center portion of the image circle. That'll create a narrower angle of view because the lens is intending to project its entire field of view out. So if you only take the center, that's all you get. And that's where we get the phrase crop factor. And we never even used to consider crop factor when talking about cinema work, because essentially all film cameras shot on Super 35 for the most part in modern parlance. But with the advent of digital photography, people who were used to shooting full frame, like 35 millimeter film photography, which is actually the same thing as VistaVision, they needed a shorthand to figure out what their field of view would look like compared to what they were used to. So we got crop factor. The focal reducer makes that mental math moot by introducing an optical element between the lens and the sensor that acts as a kind of reverse magnifying glass. Same thing as when we used to use magnifying glasses as a kid to kind of burn leaves in the playground. You know what I mean? So it takes the large full frame image circle and optically compresses it down to a smaller, denser circle of light that matches the physical size of whatever smaller sensor you may have. And that compression does two things. First, it widens the angle of view by allowing you to see the entire full frame imaging circle, as well as the full character of that lens, which is often considered preferable. If your lens is kind of cheap or doesn't have good qualities around the edges, not using a speed booster might be nice because that center punch of any lens tends to be the sharpest. So if you can't afford a nicer lens or you don't want that fudgy quality, just don't use a speed booster, you know. Second, about the compression thing, because it concentrates that exact same volume of light coming out of the back of that full frame lens into a much smaller area, it increases the concentration of light hitting the sensor, making the final image brighter, like the magnifying glass. So to understand exactly how this alters exposure and depth of field, we need to establish a critical industry distinction, which is f-stops versus t-stops. So an f-stop is a purely geometric measurement. It's the focal length divided by the diameter of the lens's entrance pupil. So that dictates your depth of field, which is the area in focus, and the physical size of your blur circles, which is the blurriness of the background. They are separate, right? Depth of field does not refer to the blurriness. It refers to what is acceptably in focus. It's important to get those thoughts different, because that's where a lot of one element of this misinformation comes from. The second thing is t-stops. Those measure the actual light transmission. So that's the actual amount of light coming in that makes it through the glass layers to hit the sensor. We use t-stops in filmmaking so that when we're using a set of lenses, we can effectively set exposures, right? Because light hits the internal resistance as it goes through all the various pieces of glass. A lens set to a geometric aperture of f2.8 might only transmit a light value of T3, something like that. So we don't want to have one camera or setup look different than the other just because of a lens difference, right? So hence t-stops. So when you introduce a focal reducer, it takes your physical f-stop and mathematically compresses it. So if you attach, here's where the numbers come in. If you attach a 50 millimeter f2.8 full frame lens on a speed booster, which is 0.71 times, the system is physically re-engineered into a 35.5 millimeter lens with a geometric value, the f-stop, of f2. Because that same volume of light is now squeezed into a tighter space, the light transmission also jumps by one full stop, meaning a potential baseline transmission of T2.8 is concentrated down to an effective exposure of T2. But that is separate from the f-stop, right? So while a focal reducer changes your mathematical depth of field in t-stop, it is obviously not going to transform your camera into a full frame sensor. I think this is evident, but it's important to make the distinction if we're doing an academic video article here. So obviously your photo sites aren't physically growing larger. You're not getting a higher capacity for those photo sites. Your sensor's dynamic range is completely unchanged. Even if you feed it a brighter image circle, it also lacks the downsampling math and low frequency noise floor of the potential higher K oversampled alternative. You're just projecting a brighter, more concentrated optical image onto the exact same small photo sites, right? Furthermore, because you're pushing that lens through extra glass, the character of the background blur will not look identical to a native lens, right? Which I think is another point of confusion. The speed boosted lens doesn't create a blurrier background. It just creates a different one. Again, your background blurriness depends on more factors than just speed boostedness. You know, by putting a 50 on a speed booster on your smaller sensor, you're not getting the look of the 50, you're getting the look of a 35.5. But again, it gets complicated. All of this stuff can be found in books, you know, ASC manual, stuff like that. But the distinction between, you know, geometric blur and optical rendering has been thoroughly documented for free by YouTube's favorite DP, Steve Yedlin, who I actually had on Frame and Reference a few months ago. He talks about it in some of his essays on his website. So you can go check those out, but his extensive testing demonstrates that what we perceive as background blur is entirely defined by mathematic ratios. Specifically, the physical size of the blur circle relative to the subject determined by the physical diameter of the lens's entrance pupil. So if you can match those ratios by compensating with your lens selection, aperture, and distance to subject, the rendering of the image is completely interchangeable. The viewer is not going to look at a final image and be able to identify the sensor size based purely on depth of field, or blurriness, or whatever, or distortion, which we'll get to in a bit. This means that you don't need a speed booster to achieve a given look, and there very well might be a native lens that you could use instead, especially considering the constant deluge of new lenses hitting the market seemingly every week. So to see how this works, let's trace the physical aperture diameter of a native 50mm lens shot at f4. The physical diameter of the opening, the f-stop, is going to be 12.5 millimeters because it's 50 millimeters divided by 4, right? So if you put that same 50mm lens on your speed booster and put it on a Super 35 camera, it literally becomes that aforementioned 35.5mm lens. By adding glass, you're essentially just building a new lens, right? You're just adding another element into the lens. It's not magic. So to maintain that exact 12.5mm physical opening with our new 35.5mm focal length, our target f-stop becomes an f2.8 because it's 35.5 divided by 12.5. Leaving your physical lens ring set at 4 delivers the effective f2.8 geometry, right? And whatever the extra t-stop is in that case, because it won't be exactly 2.8 to 4, it'll be whatever, if the photo lens isn't measured in t-stops, who knows what it actually is. But do you get what I'm saying? The magnification or intensification of the speed booster is behind the aperture. So the aperture is being effectively shrunk, right? So here's how that math applies to the two setups that filmmakers constantly try to compare. What happens if we shoot both of these lens combinations on the exact same Super 35 camera body from the same position, same camera position, looking at the same subject? Because the speed booster setup has a wider field of view, it captures more of the background, making those blur circles look smaller relative to the overall frame. So to make it match the non-speed boosted look, you have to physically move the camera closer to the subject with the speed boosted setup. So moving closer increases the magnification ratio, which narrows the depth of field and expands those background blur circles until the images match, basically. But again, this is just matching two images. This isn't inherently a full frame look and can be achieved by undoing our math and shooting a native 35mm lens at a true 2.8. But you will have a stop less exposure, obviously, which can be compensated with your lights or bumping the ISO a stop, depending on whatever your shooting situation is. And they're going to look identical. Using the 50 didn't suddenly do anything different than using the 35 in that, the 50 on the speed booster versus a native 35. But what happens when we look at actual real world comparison, the real world comparison that filmmakers are trying to make, which is that native 50 on a full frame camera versus the same 50 on a speed boosted Super 35 camera. So because the focal reducer has already compressed the image circle down to the size of a Super 35 sensor, the new 35.5mm focal length automatically yields a field of view that matches the original 50mm on the full frame camera. So that's taken care of. If you keep both cameras in the exact same physical position, shooting the exact same subject, same distance, the field of view is going to be identical, and your aperture diameter is identical at 12.5. So by leaving the aperture ring at f4 on both cameras, both the optics handle the math for you, and the size of the geometric background blur circles will match the full frame shot without having to do anything. But again, there's nothing about the full frame camera, nothing about the speed booster that's doing anything special to the look of your image beyond that extra stop of light and potentially seeing the extra edge character of that lens, because you're seeing the whole lens now. To otherwise replicate this exact speed boosted image using purely native unadapted glass on your Super 35 camera, you just, again, mount that native 35 lens, set its aperture to 2.8. So you've got the full frame look just by making a different lens choice. Now, the one time where this changes, and I think what people are most often thinking about when they're thinking about the full frame look and using a speed booster, is if you try to get the ultra shallow aesthetic of something like a native full frame 85mm f1.2 on a Super 35 camera from the exact same camera position, right? Because you might be shooting in a field, but a room size might change where you have to put the camera, right? And maybe you want that 85 f1.2. So in that case, you need to find a Super 35 60mm f 0.85 lens. So that's probably not happening. So in that case, sure, by using a focal reducer with that 85, you've achieved a look on your Super 35 sensor that only full frame can achieve. But once again, it's because the equivalent Super 35 lens probably doesn't exist, not that the full frame sensor is somehow letting you get that look alone. And this is mildly pedantic. I just got in a spirited debate with someone in the YouTube comments of a different, not one of my videos, which did make me make this article and then all the further articles I'll be releasing. But it's an important distinction to make because if I'm being honest, who on earth wants to shoot that shallow? I just tested out the Fujifilm Eterna with my Medicon 65 f1.2. And it was certainly a cool look. And the lens itself actually has a very beautiful, soft, out of focus character. The bokeh is very, it's not chattery or anything, but it's almost impossible to use. The same thing with an equivalent like full frame 50mm f1.2, or if that Medicon was existed for the same look on Super 35, it'd be a 35mm f.77, which you can sort of find. I have an X mount 7 Artisans 35mm f.95, but all of those lenses, they're all abysmal to attempt to work with in a real world fashion wide open. If you weren't around for the 5D revolution, so to speak, we really beat that horse to death when it was novel, but it wasn't practical in any capacity. Plus, if Reddit is anything to go by, people are sick of completely blown out smooth backgrounds and the children yearn for environments the characters are inhabiting and being able to see it. And also all of our favorite movies were likely shot on Super 35 anywhere from f2 to f5.6 or even more. I was just talking to the Spider Noir guys for Frame and Reference, which will be out in 2 weeks. So depending on when you watch this, it's out or not. And they were shooting at f11 sometimes because it fit the noir aesthetic. But in any case, those are normal apertures and any lens can do that. Here's a scenario where a larger sensor or the speed booster is actually helpful from an operational and lens reality sense. You're in a car, you're in the passenger seat, you're filming the driver with the Eterna and you want a medium shot. You want to shoot at f2.8 for focus. You're probably going to need something like a 32mm lens. That's easy enough to find. You need one that'll cover the Eterna sensor, but somewhere around a 32 or a 35mm f2.8 lens exists for the GFX system or some PL mount that can cover it. Those lenses are not hard to come by anymore with the advent of these larger sensors. On full frame, you would need something like a 25mm lens, and on Super 35, you would need an 18. Again, all to get that medium shot. So to match the look of the 32mm lens on the Eterna at 2.8 on a full frame camera, you would need your lens to open up to f2. So not a problem there. However, on Super 35, your 18mm is going to need to be able to open up to 1.4, which is probably harder to find, but also potentially can be a poorly calibrated wide angle lens if you're on a budget and might have some unwanted distortion, looking fisheye-ish. In that case, sure, slapping the nicer full frame 24mm on the speed booster will get you there and everyone's happy. But, and this is the other thing that I think really trips people up, not all wide angle lenses distort by default. And surprise, it depends on the camera position. One of the most single important laws of optics to remember is that lenses do not create perspective. Distance does. If you don't move the camera, the spatial relationship between the driver's nose, the ears, the steering wheel, the background is completely locked in stone by the laws of physics. It's if you shoot with a whatever camera and then you crop in, the image doesn't change and the lens is just doing that before it hits the sensor. right? Because all of our cameras are sitting in the exact same passenger seat, the exact same distance from the driver, the light rays entering the lens travel along the exact same paths. So if you have a really high quality set of lenses, when the Eterna samples that space with a 32 millimeter lens and the Super 35 samples it with an 18 millimeter lens, they're capturing the exact same spatial grid. Now, if the lens is bowing light, that's different, but it's not going to do that by default. In the real world, we associate wide-angle lenses like the 18 with sort of the egghead distortion or stretched noses or crazy looks like fisheye. But that distortion doesn't happen because the lens is an 18 millimeter. It happens because of where you choose to put the 18 millimeter. On a Super 35 camera, if you want a tight close-up of a face, an 18 millimeter forces you to physically shove the camera 6 inches from the actor's nose. And that close proximity is what causes the perspective distortion. Because in our car example, we want a medium shot, the camera isn't 6 inches from their face. It's a few feet away in the passenger seat. And at that distance, the perspective is naturally normal, relatively flattering. Now, in the real world, a native 18 millimeter Super 35 lens has to bend light pretty aggressively to achieve its wide field of view. And even some high-end lenses can introduce slight barrel distortion or stretched pixels at the extreme edges of the frame. So the driver's shoulder or the car door frame might look a little pulled. But once again, this is a lens issue. It has nothing to do with the larger sensor. But more critically, it can be fixed by just getting a nicer lens. So that's where the focal reducer can be incredibly important. If you can't find nicer lenses and you're in one of those tight scenarios, then that will stop that specific distortion. But again, there exist in the world wide angle lenses that don't distort because of the lens. Does that make sense? So all this is to say, focal reducers or speed boosters are incredibly powerful optical tools for altering field of view and maximizing light transmission on smaller formats. If you're shooting clubs or concerts or anything like that, that extra stop of light can be very helpful. And it can, like we said in the car example or whatever, get you out of trouble on the extreme ends of practical shooting. But it's just optimizing the smaller format. It doesn't replicate a larger one. And the larger sensor only has technical advantages as opposed to optical ones. So wrapping this up, does a speed booster give you the full frame look? No. And that is because there is no full frame look. Unless you want that 85 millimeter f1.2 look, then sure. But that's not because it's full frame. That's because that lens exists. And you might be the people saying, oh, you're being pedantic. Again, yes, but it's an important distinction to make because, again, if we're trying to, as artists and purchasers oftentimes, or even renters of these systems, we want to come at them with from a place of education. So Speed Booster doesn't do anything special. You can replicate the look of large format with native glass on a Super 35 or smaller sensor. You just got to find that glass. And these days, those lenses are not hard to find. So I know that was a lot, but hopefully it was informative. I did my best to do all the research that I could without blowing my brains out. And yeah, hopefully we never have to talk about this again.